In this series, we're going to go over the commander ban list and talk about each card, why they're banned, and why people might want them unbanned. Today, we'll be wrapping up the series with a bunch of cards we've already talked about in other ban list videos, so we'll be doing it in a bit of a speed round. Without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. Starting us off, we have Tolarian Academy. This is a legendary land with the ability where you can tap it to add 1 blue for each artifact you control. This card was banned all the way back in June of 2010. So why was this card banned? Academy was really good at making a lot of mana fast, an attribute that's gotten a ton of cards banned. Academy is a part of a cycle of lands with very similar abilities alongside Gaia's Cradle and Serra's Sanctum. Cradle taps for 1 green for each creature you control, whereas Sanctum taps for white equal to the number of enchantments you control. Both of these cards have already shown themselves to be very powerful in Commander. Basically, if you're playing a deck built around either creatures or enchantments, you should be playing the card, as they just offer way too much mana for way too little cost. Academy takes this up to 11. For one, there are plenty of powerful 0 mana artifacts that can be used to power up your Academy, making it far easier to get an Academy tapping for unfair amounts. Making this even worse is the fact that artifact-based decks tend to be very strong anyway. One of the most broken commanders in the format is Urza, Lord High Artificer, due to his ability to tap your artifacts for mana. Giving these decks access to Academy would just let them close games even faster and easier. The card can also kind of just be played in any blue deck, as most decks in the format are already playing a good number of artifacts anyway. Most decks are already playing a Soul Ring and a Mana Crypt, or at least would be if Crypt weren't quite pricey. On top of that, tons of other decks will be relying on Signets to ramp them. The point is that there just isn't much deck building cost to making Academy work. Due to how overwhelmingly powerful the card is and how easy it is to use, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Tolarian Academy? There aren't really many people who want the card back. The card is banned basically everywhere because it's just far too good and too easy to break. The only angle where banning it really makes sense is just from wanting a shorter ban list. But Academy is a very reasonable ban. The card would be bad for both casual and competitive players, so there's not really a reason to bring it back. Next up, we have Yawgmoth's Bargain. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 4 and 2 black. It is abilities where you skip your draw step and you pay 1 life to draw a card. This card was banned in May of 2006. Why was Yawgmoth's Bargain banned? Well, it doesn't take long to see the comparison to Griselbrand, another card on the commander ban list. The ability to draw as many cards as you want just by paying life is always powerful, but it's even better in Commander where players' life totals are inflated. Drawing 20 or so cards is usually enough to just win the game, either through some sort of combo or just having too many threats and answers for your opponent to keep up with. Of course, this applies equally both to Griselbrand and Bargain. When compared to Griselbrand, Bargain has a few notable upsides and downsides. Griselbrand doesn't lock your draws and can be cheated into play more easily thanks to various reanimate effects. However, Bargain costs less mana up front, which makes it castable in a lot of situations where other similar cards simply aren't. However, the main reason the card was banned was just because of how powerful the draw itself is. What are the arguments for unbanning Yawgmoth's Bargain? There's one very strange point surrounding Bargain's ban, and its name is Necropotence. This card has basically the same effect as Bargain, except it puts the card into your hand at the end of the turn and only costs 3 black mana, not a full 6 mana. In just about every conceivable way, Necropotence is just better than Bargain. The only edge Bargain has is drawing the cards right away, which just doesn't matter when the cards come down so much later. Even worse, at high levels of play, Necropotence has an even greater edge because it's tutorable off of Zur the Enchanter, who is a legendary creature and therefore a valid commander. With all of this in mind, there aren't really any good reasons for Bargain to remain banned, while Necropotence is completely legal. You could argue that Necro should be banned alongside Bargain, but it's kind of arguable. Overall, it just doesn't make sense for Necropotence to be off the list while Bargain is on it. Next up, we have Tinker. This is a sorcerer with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. As an additional cost to cast Tinker, you have to sacrifice an artifact. It has the effect where you search a library for an artifact, put it into the battlefield, and then shuffle. This card was banned in March of 2009. Why was Tinker banned? Being able to tutor an artifact directly into play is very powerful, and Tinker doesn't ask for anywhere near a high enough cost to make the effect fair. We've already gone over how common artifacts are in the format thanks to artifact mana. It should maybe go without saying, but there are tons of very powerful artifacts to find off of Tinker. Some of the highlights would be cards like Bolas's Citadel, which lets you cast spells from the top of your library for no mana by paying life, or even cards like Portal to Phyrexia, which forces each opponent to sacrifice 3 creatures when it enters the battlefield and reanimates a creature each turn. So you have a card that can find game-ending threats and put them into play for very little mana, and has a very small deck building cost in order to make work, namely playing some of the best cards in the format. This isn't even getting into the versatility of the card and how it can be used to respond to a ton of different situations. For all of these reasons combined, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Tinker? This is another card that's hard to find a good reason to unban. The card is banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage for good reason. It makes artifact decks extremely powerful and can steal games out of nowhere very easily. There's not really any world I can see where the card would be unbanned and be okay. Next up is Time Vault. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It is the abilities where it enters the battlefield tapped. Time Vault doesn't untap during your untap step, and if it would begin a turn while Time Vault is tapped, you can instead skip that turn and untap Time Vault. Finally, you can tap the Vault to take an extra turn. This card was banned in December of 2008. Why was Time Vault banned? There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that the card is just broken. All you have to do is play any card that could untap Time Vault once a turn, and you can take infinite turns, effectively winning the game on the spot. There are so many cards that can do this, to the point where you can be rest assured if you ever draw your Time Vault, you'll be able to go infinite. This alone might be enough to ban the card, but there's also an accessibility issue. This is a reserved list card, and one that was only printed twice, once in Unlimited and again in a collector's edition. And the collector's edition print isn't even tournament legal. Vaults will set you back several $100s, and that's something that would only get worse with time. Unbanning this card would require players to either proxy or cough up far too much money on a single card to compete. While Commander isn't a very competitive format, people do want games to be a bit fair, and this kind of lopsided card would hurt games a lot. For all of these reasons, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Time Vault? This is another very uncontroversial ban. Not only is the combo broken, it's also not fun to play against. Watching your opponent take infinite turns until they find an actual way to win is just very boring. The combination of being far too strong and the fact that almost no one owns copies of the card means that no one is pushing for the card to come off the ban list. Next up, we have Library of Alexandria. This is a land with the abilities where you can tap it for 1 colorless mana, and you can tap it to draw a card, but only if you have exactly 7 cards in hand. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was this card banned? The accessibility issue is even worse here. This card has only ever had 1 printing and runs for around the price of a used car. And no, that's not an exaggeration. Outside of being too difficult to get a hold of, the card is also very good. You lose basically nothing, but in the right circumstances, it can push you extremely far ahead. Drawing an extra card every turn is a great effect, and the restriction of needing 7 cards in hand isn't the hardest thing in the world to get to work. The thing is, even if it doesn't go your way, it doesn't really matter. Even if you never draw a card off of Library, you haven't lost anything by playing it. It doesn't hurt you at all, so the only cost is opportunity cost. Considering the card costs you nothing to play, at least within the terms of the game, and can just win entire games on its own, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Library of Alexandria? This is a bit of a weird case, as the biggest issue nowadays really is just the accessibility. The power level of the card isn't all that high. It's a lot harder to keep yourself at 7 cards in hand and keep drawing than it used to be, and even more difficult in multiplayer formats. If the card were more accessible, it would be contentious, but it might not ever get banned. The main problem is only the fact that to reasonably play it, you have to bust out the old Sharpie on basic land trick. Next is Fastbond. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 green. It has abilities where you can play any number of lands on each of your turns, but whenever you play a land, if it wasn't the first land you played that turn, Fastbound deals 1 damage to you. This card was banned in June of 2009. Why was Fastbound banned? While this isn't a reserved list card, it's a bit easier to get a hold of than some of the last entries. This card is mostly banned for power level reasons, as it's very easy to combo off with Fastbound. The easiest way to do this is to use some way to sacrifice lands with a card that lets you play lands from your graveyard. Basically, this just lets you cycle lands in and out of your graveyard as many times as you have a life for, or even infinitely as long as you have a way to gain life along the way. Once you do this, you can use your infinite mana to win the game, or maybe win through infinite landfall triggers. Of course, this is another card where you don't have to go infinite with a card to be worth it. Sometimes just playing out all the lands in your hand on turn 1 is enough to put you in a winning position. Fastbound is one of those cards that never does anything fair. It only really leads to one player either winning right away, or it's just a dead card, due to just how easy it is to win because of the card, it was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Fastbound? This is a card that's just too good for the format. Green really doesn't need any more busted land ramp cards. Giving the color this on top of everything else that's going for it would make the color far too strong and casual. And while CEDH isn't the biggest consideration, there's a good chance it would be far too good there too. Next up, we have Flash. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the effect where you put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Then you sacrifice it unless you pay its mana cost minus 2 generic mana. This card was banned in April of 2020. Why was Flash banned? Flash was banned due to how it interacted with one card in particular, Protean Hulk. Hulk is a 6/6 for 5 and 2 green with the ability Wear. When it dies, you search your library for any number of creature cards with total mana value 6 or less, put them into the battlefield, and then shuffle. Though, it might as well just say, when this dies, you win, because that's how it plays out in practice. The combo lines have changed a lot over time, but suffice to say that there's always been a way to win the game when Hulk dies. Flash and Hulk together, then, allow you to win the game at instant speed for 2 mana, which is as good as it sounds. This wasn't an issue in casual play, but in CEDH, it was basically destroying the format. Flash Hulk was one of the only things worth doing in the format, and the mirror was pretty miserable. If one player attempted to go off, any other players holding the combo could go off in response. Most games were essentially a Mexican standoff, with 2 or more players holding a proverbial gun to each other's throats. There was some contention on if the rules committee should ban cards for the CEDH community, but since no one was really playing Flash, they decided it was fine to ban. What are the arguments for unbanning Flash? This one has an interesting story, because Protean Hulk was banned in the format for years. However, right as it was reprinted in Masters 25, the card was released back in the format, as it was thought that it should probably be fine. Of course, it turned out to be doing the exact same thing it always did. It really makes one wonder why they ever unbanned Hulk in the first place. Flash had been around for years without doing anything, but then they unbanned the one card it had ever seen play with and it had to be banned. Hulk really seems to be the problem card in the interaction here. Next up, we have Channel. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 green. It is the effect where, until the end of the turn, anytime you can activate a mana ability, you may pay 1 life. If you do, you add 1 colorless mana. This card was banned in June of 2010. Why was Channel banned? This is basically the opposite version of Yawgmoth's bargain, giving you mana for life instead of giving you cards for life. This does basically the same thing, which is let you win the game right then and there. It's a little bit more difficult to make work, and often you hold back on your channel until later in the game instead of slamming it as soon as you can. Still, it allows you to do things like infinitely recast Ancestral Statue with an Aetherflux Reservoir on the board to eventually gain infinite life, and then laser down each of your opponents one by one. While this might be problematic at high levels of play, it's possibly worse at casual tables, where it can be used to cast a ton of cards like Ujin the Spear Dragon and Kozilek Butcher of the Truth on turn 2. While this won't always let you win the game, it usually will. The ease with which Channel can end games out of nowhere led to the card being banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Channel? Well, there's not much clamoring for the card to come back. While it might not be as good as other combos already available in CEDH, it probably would be problematic in casual play. And that's what the Commander ban list is supposed to be designed for anyway. There just doesn't seem to be a good outcome that would come from unbanning Channel. Next up, we have Balance. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. It is the effect where each player chooses a number of lands they control equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controls the fewest, then sacrifices the rest. The players discard cards and sacrifice creatures the same way. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was Balance banned? Balance is very good at leaving your opponent with no meaningful game actions. If you spend the first 2 turns of the game playing out artifacts, emptying your hand, and not playing creatures, then casting Balance will often force your opponent to discard their entire hands and sacrifice all their creatures. And if you find a way to get rid of most of your lands, you can basically make it an Armageddon too. Getting all of this for 2 mana can put you really far ahead, especially if you've been playing powerful artifacts beforehand. This is particularly bad at more casual tables where players will be less prepared to play against these kinds of effects. Stacks effects are very common in CEDH, whereas they are heavily discouraged in casual games. As a result, players in casual games don't play the kind of cheap interaction and card draw needed to stand a chance against these kinds of cards. Due to how disruptive the card can be to games, it was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Balance? There's not much. The card would probably be fine in CEDH, but that's not what the ban list is for. For casual play, the card is a worse version of basically every effect people hate in the game. Balance is probably the poster child for cards that stops you from playing, so it's not a surprise that it's banned in the format. For the final card in the series, we have the infamous Shahrazad. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of 2 white. It is the effect where players play a magic sub-game, using their libraries as their deck, and each player who doesn't win the sub-game loses half their life rounded up. This card was banned in December of 2005. Why was Shahrazad banned? I feel like this one is pretty self-explanatory. I just want you to imagine this. You're nearing the end of a nearly 2-hour-long game of Commander with your friends. Players have come close to winning several times, only to be barely stopped at the last second. Suddenly, a player casts Shahrazad. What kind of play experience do you think that's going to have? Frustrating is putting it far too lightly. Shahrazad favorably does nothing but waste everyone's time. Games that would normally only be a couple hours long, an already ridiculous amount of time for any card game to take, and something that people says needs to be fixed in the format, and extends it to a quite possibly twice that length. It's not like Shahrazad even has much of an impact on the game it's played in, as players losing half their life is bad, but not necessarily game ending. From a practical perspective, it's even worse. Commander board states tend to get pretty big. You'll need 2 full-size kitchen tables to resolve Shahrazad's effect, one to hold the first game, and one to hold the sub-game. Honestly, if someone casts this card in the game I was playing, I might just scoop right there. What are the arguments for unbanning Shahrazad? Well, it's not technically broken, it's not the most powerful effect out there, and you might try to argue that if there are cards that waste people's time like Thieves' Auction in the format, why not let Shahrazad in? However, the practical concerns alone are enough for the card to be banned. It has a much worse effect on games it's played in than other cards that tend to be frustrating to have resolved. Shahrazad might not be the most powerful card in Magic, but it's still the most disruptive to play. Alright, and that's the series. A quick thanks to everyone for watching, and as always, if you have any thoughts or ideas for future videos like this one, we'd love to hear about them down in the comments below.